Hey everybody, this is the fourth here, and in this video I wanted to introduce you to another technique regarding EQ, and this is the technique you can use to give each sound its own space in the mix. So in the previous video I looked at removing unnecessary frequencies from your sound by using high pass and low pass filters. And a lot of what I said in that video is relevant to this one as well. I mentioned that high passing certain sounds can help give the bass its own space in the mix because, you're just removing bass frequencies from other sounds that don't really need them so that the bass can come through nice and cleanly. And then low passing certain sounds can help your cymbals cut through the mix, your hi-hats, and even just other more important sounds that have a nice high-end present will be allowed to cut through the mix more if you're low passing some of the other background sounds. So the previous technique is definitely a part of this and really does help to give sounds their own space a little bit. But low passing and high passing alone won't be able to give every sound its own space. You're gonna have sounds that will be overlapping by some amount, and more than likely, there's gonna be quite a bit of overlap in your sounds. And, this overlap is normal, it's perfectly fine. It's actually a good thing. A song made with sounds that have no overlapping frequencies at all would sound pretty weird. It would probably be pretty empty, pretty minimal. And if you were EQing like a full mix to sound that way, that would sound really weird. So the goal isn't to prevent any overlap, but just to ensure that the best qualities of each sound, especially your more important sounds, can be heard clearly and aren't buried by the other sounds in the mix. So in this video, I'm going to show you an example using a lead sound here, and a bass sound. And these sounds play together at the same time, and you can see that they both have very full frequency responses. They both really fill up the frequency spectrum. And when I play them together, it sounds like this. And it doesn't sound bad. I could call this a mix and say it's good and say I'm happy with it, but I can also make it a bit better. If you listen to the bass on its own, you can hear it has certain characters to it that sound really good. But if I put that lead over the top of it, they don't come through the mix as clearly as I would like. And this is a case where you would want to use an EQ to help that sound come through the mix a little bit better. And I do want to mention something because there is kind of a mistake that some people run into, and this is, if you have a sound that isn't quite coming through the mix very well, the first thing you should try to do is see if you can just increase the level of that sound without messing up your mix. Usually if you ask about how to help a sound come through the mix better, people will instantly tell you EQ, compression, all this stuff. But a lot of the time it can be fixed just with increasing the level of that. And that's a much better thing to do than to EQ straight away. At least see if you can increase the level and see if it will sound good in the mix or if it will kind of mess up the mix. And if you can't increase the level, or if you do increase the level and it's still not coming through clearly enough, then EQ is definitely going to be your answer. So just first try to see if your levels are actually right, and then after you make sure your levels are right, use the EQ. So in this example, the levels of both the sounds I am happy with. So for me, I'm going to want to use EQ to help the bass cut through the mix. And so the problem here is my bass isn't coming through as clearly as I would like. So what I want to do is remove certain frequencies from the lead to help that bass come through more. So you can see I have an EQ on that lead sound. And this is what it looks like. And if I turn that on, you'll hear that the bass just comes through a lot better. So here it is with it off. And make sure you're not listening to this too loudly. You won't be able to hear it as well if you're listening to it quite loudly. Just make sure you're monitoring at an appropriate level. So here it is without the EQ. And you can hear that the bass, it's not too bad, but it doesn't come through quite as clearly as I would like through that lead. So here it is with that EQ on. So you should be able to hear a pretty noticeable difference between it being on and it being off. It's not the hugest difference, and either way could be a presentable song, but with that EQ on, it just sounds quite a bit better to me. The bass cuts through the mix quite a bit more, which is what I want. And so let's look at how exactly I did this. Now, if you look at the frequencies of the lead, you can see that there's quite a bit of low frequency information, and that low frequency information is going to distract from the bass frequencies of that bass. And I didn't want that, I wanted to clean that up, so I added on that high pass filter. And then I also made a couple of cuts. So how exactly did I determine the frequencies of which I wanted to cut? And there are a bunch of different ways you could do that. How you go about it doesn't really matter, just as long as the end result is you cutting the frequencies that are distracting from the sound. So you could put an EQ on the lead sound and then make a cut and kind of sweep it until you can hear the desired character of the bass a bit better. You could do it that way. But the way that I personally like to do it is I will put a band pass on the sound that I want to cut through the mix better. So I want the bass to cut through the mix better, and I'm going to put a band pass on the bass. So I'll add an EQ, change one of the bands to the type of a band pass, and I'm going to make it pretty steep, pretty thin band, just so I can really hear the character of that bass. And because it's kind of a bandpass, I'm reducing a lot of frequencies. I'm going to boost it a little bit just to help me hear it better. And I'm going to mute that lead and just listen to the bass. And I can adjust the frequency, and if I adjust it and really listen to the bass, I can hear how different frequency ranges of that bass sound. And so if I do this and listen really carefully, I should be able to hear things that stand out to me as having a really good character, that really make up that character of the bass that I like. And I can toggle between this EQ being on and off. So I can kind of have it off, listen to the whole bass, and try and find out what I like about it. And I hear two things that I really like. One is kind of in the lower mids, and one is in the higher frequencies. So I'm going to find what I like in the lower mids first. And I guess you'll find that out with me. And so you can hear that right there. It's this sound here at about 531 Hertz. And you can see if I look in the EQ where I cut about 452. That's really close to 531. So for this example, I'm actually going to copy this value because before I did this quickly. I wasn't listening as carefully as I am now. And then I'm going to paste that on here to that third band. And now you can see it's cutting 531. And what I'll do is I'll take that band then and drag it all the way down. And after I do that, I'm going to find the high frequency that I like while this band pass is still what I'm doing. So I'll turn that off real quick again so I can hear it. And I'll turn it back on. So I can hear that at about 2905 Hertz, so 2905 Hertz. And what I would do is then copy that value for the frequency and paste it on this fifth band here. And you can see again they're just slightly different. And that's probably just because I'm listening a bit closer while I'm doing this now. So I would paste that value and drag that all the way down. And now I'm going to turn off the bandpass EQ so I have just the whole bass sound coming through. And I'm going to play the lead sound. And you can hear it sounds completely, empty because I've cut out so much. And really the main reason I do this is just to help me remember that I need to cut these frequencies. So, I'm going to bring them back up and only cut them a little bit. And then I'll play around with it until it sounds as good as possible. And when you do this, you shouldn't have to cut too much, depending on the sounds you're using and depending on how much you want to cut through and all that. And while you do it, you can toggle that EQ on and off to compare the results of it without those cuts. And then with those cuts. And that's just helpful to make sure you're not cutting those frequency bands too much, and losing some important character of the sound. So this particular lead sound, I'm not too concerned about cutting these bands a fair amount. I'm still not cutting them hugely, but I'm cutting them both by about, about 4 decibels. And, that just really helps that bass come through. And maybe that's a bit much. I could always fine tune it later and get everything sounding just perfect. But hopefully that can give you an idea of how you can use EQ to kind of help different sounds cut through the mix a bit better. And you're not going to have to do this for every sound in your mix. Basically what I do is I'll set the level of the sound, and when I'm pretty confident that that level is set right, I'll listen to the mix and see, is any main element kind of being covered up a little bit by some other element? Or do 2 main elements not allow each other to come through the mix as clearly as I would like? Is anything causing things to sound not super clear? And if things sound pretty good, then I'll just leave it. I won't really need to EQ it. But if, as in this example, the lead sound is kind of, taking away from the character of the bass that I really want to cut through the mix well, then I can, add that EQ to use this technique to cut those frequencies and really help that bass to cut through better. And if you ask me, using that EQ on that lead makes it sound quite a bit better. I am, using a couple boosts as well that I made originally. I might be boosting the high a bit too much. So, this isn't something that you have to do for every sound. If you want your certain sound to cut through the mix, it doesn't mean that you have to cut these frequencies on every single other sound in your mix. Because if you were to do that, and if you were to do that for, every sound, if you wanted every sound to really cut through the mix well, and you were doing this for every sound and cutting every other sound based on every sound, you're just going to end up cutting like all the frequencies on all your sounds, and it's just going to really, be an unnecessarily long process, and you'll just be cutting, way too much, way more than you really have to. So mostly use this technique if something isn't quite coming through the mix quite as well as you would like, and, increasing the level of it isn't the answer. You can find out what sounds exactly are kind of causing that sound to get a little bit buried in the mix, and then you can use an EQ to cut those other sounds at specific frequencies to help that sound come through the mix better. Specifically, how you go about doing this in terms of which sounds you do this with and how they relate to each other and all that is going to be something that will change from one mix to the next, and it's really something, it's a part of the process. It's going to be a part of your process that you're going to kind of have to kind of develop over time. And luckily, this isn't the most important thing in mixing, because as you could hear with the EQ off, it didn't sound horrible or anything. It's just the bass didn't come through quite as clearly as I would have liked, and with that EQ on, it really helps that to happen. So if you have the levels of your different sounds right, even if you're not particularly skilled at this, even if you're not really having all your sounds come through the mix really, really cleanly, your mix is still going to be acceptable. But, learning to cut these other sounds to help your main sounds come through, or sounds that you want to come through, is a great skill to have. It's a great skill to practice. And it will really help you to get those really clean, professional sounding mixes. And for drums, there's a different technique that can help your drums cut through the mix. So you won't have to necessarily cut frequencies out to make room for your snare and your kick, because you can use side chaining, which is something I'll cover later. Just keep in mind this is a technique if you're having problems with a sound coming through the mix. First, make sure that it's not a problem with it just being too quiet simply, and then if that's not the case, figure out what sounds are kind of covering it up in the mix and remove certain frequencies from those sounds to help your sound cut through.